And today my subject is going to be Mediterranean at the start of 1942. I guess the title here kind of gives it away. I'm going to tell how the events of a single night transformed a campaign and perhaps prolonged the fighting in North Africa for as long as a year. But before I do that, I'm going to go back a year to the summer of 1940 to give my talk a little bit of context. I change the slides here. Yes, context. The summer of 1940 was a dark time for Great Britain. France had signed an armistice with Germany, and Britain faced the twin threats of invasion and bombing by Germany's superior air force. Nevertheless, the British government made the decision to fight on. They were boasted by their worldwide empire and protected by their powerful navy. In fact, when Italy entered the war in 1940, London saw an opportunity to take the offensive against what they considered to be a much weaker foe, and a foe that seemed susceptible to British sea power. So despite the fact that the Battle of Britain was underway and German forces were amassing across the English Channel, London began reinforcing Malta and establishing a naval squadron at Gibraltar and reinforcing the Mediterranean fleet in Alexandria. Italy, in turn, joined a war that its leader, Benito Mussolini, believed was already over. Italy was looking to expand its territory at the expense of the French and British empires. The nation had a powerful navy and a large army and air force, but it lacked the resources and industrial infrastructure to fight a modern war against a major power. For example, Italy had to import nearly all of its coal and oil, and its GDP was about 1/5 that of the British Empire. When Mussolini declared war, he did not anticipate fighting in Africa. He didn't even think that it would be necessary to take Malta when the island was very lightly held. To give an indication of what the British thinking was at the time, in March 1939, Winston Churchill had written a memorandum on sea power in which he stated it would take 2 months to defeat Italy. By coincidence, this was about how long Mussolini thought the war would continue. But, Britain didn't surrender, and Italy didn't prove to be a pushover. Both Italy and Britain slowly built up forces in Africa. And in September 1940, the Italians advanced 60 miles into Egypt and dug in. There, the front line stood for a couple months, but at the end of 1940, after a stalemate at sea, a British corps won a tremendous victory over an Italian army advancing 500 miles and capturing 130,000 men. This sparked German intervention into what hitherto had been strictly an Italian theater of war. The famous General Edwin Rommel, with the spearhead of 2 German mechanized divisions and an Italian mechanized division, counterattacked the overextended British and regained most of the lost territory, driving all the way to the Egyptian frontier, except for the port of Tobruk in eastern Libya, which held out as a bridgehead behind Axis lines. Check out this map. Down here in the corner, you can see a couple of tanks. That shows you where the armies were located. Malta is in the dead center of the map. You can see these white lines are the British sea lanes, and the black lines are the Italian sea lanes. The direct British route from Gibraltar to Alexandria is obviously blocked. It's kind of interesting the way that the sea lanes intersected in the center of the Mediterranean, with Malta at the center of it all. I should also add that the 2 major Italian ports, Tripoli and Benghazi, were limited in the amount of cargo that they could receive. They combined had a capacity under ideal conditions, under perfect conditions, good weather, no attacks, et cetera, of about 120,000 tons of cargo a month. In the event over the 2 years of the campaign, they were able to average about 70,000 tons of cargo received. So in any case, in July 1941, an Axis army, an Italo-German army, defeated a British offensive. This was the Battle Axe offensive, and both sides kind of hunkered down, continuing to accrue strength for yet another test of arms. As I think everybody here knows, the problem with fighting in North Africa was logistics. Everything you need, munitions, fuel, food, and even water, has to be shipped in. For the British, given the fact that the Italian forces had closed the direct passage to Egypt, it was a 2-month journey from England around Africa up the Red Sea. But at least the journey was mostly safe once you were past the submarines and the Western approaches. For the Italians, it was a journey of 2 to 3 days, but it was a journey that was full of peril. Shipping, as you can see, had to follow routes subject to attack from British submarines and aircraft. The fact that Malta lay dead center in the Italian lines of communications and served as a base for British air and submarine forces made the journey all that much more dangerous. And through the summer and fall of 1941, the British made vigorous efforts to interdict Axis traffic to North Africa, and they did so with growing success. Okay, all this brings us to October 1941, which is where this tale begins. Since July, both sides have been building up men and supplies. I think I already said that. And both sides were preparing to take the offensive in November. For the British, the goal was to relieve Tobruk and then drive all the way to Tripoli, kicking the Axis out of North Africa. Anticipating the very best, the British were holding 4 divisions in reserve in the United Kingdom, hoping to invade Sicily. For the Axis powers, the first goal was, of course, to capture Tobruk. Second goal was Suez Canal. And after that, theoretically, the entire British position in the Middle East was up for grabs. The stakes were high. And also you have to remember that in October 1941, the Germans were deep inside the Soviet Union, and they were just beginning their offensive against Moscow. The outcome was clearly uncertain, but the smart money, at least in the Russian front, was on Berlin. Also at this time, the British were starting to benefit from ultra intelligence. And when I say ultra, what I mean is intelligence gained from the decryption of Enigma-coded radio traffic. The volume of this traffic was pretty high. They were getting 30 to 50 ultra notifications a day in Alexandria. It had the potential for being a decisive British asset. But unfortunately, the policies and the procedures for its use, not to mention the trust in its reliability, were still under development. And it did not provide to the British the benefit that it later would. The tools of the job. This slide happens to show an Italian S-79 tri-motor medium bomber. You can see that it's configured to carry torpedoes. There's a little torpedo slung under the airplane. The inability of the Italian Air Force to provide proper support to the Navy is pretty well known, and it profoundly affected operations, especially in the war's first year. But by November 1941, we're well past that point. The S-79 was, in fact, an effective naval bomber. In 1941, 260 S-79s, or the very similar S-84, made or attempted torpedo attacks against Allied shipping. They damaged or sank 39 Allied ships, including the battleship Nelson. 14 were shot down, including 6 in the attack against Nelson, I might add, and 46 were damaged. So that was very dangerous work for the Italian aviators. In any case, to increase the chances of a successful offensive, Winston Churchill insisted, against the wishes of the Royal Navy, that a surface strike force consisting of a pair of small cruisers and 2 large destroyers be based in Malta to increase the pressure on Axis forces to Africa, Axis traffic to Africa. This force was called Force K. Here's a picture of a destroyer at Malta. This is not part of Force K, this is the Gurkha, but it's very similar. Now I should also note that because of the limited number of berths at its ports, the Italians were required to run between 20 to 30 convoys a month from Italy to Africa. These generally consisted of 1 to 3 vessels escorted by a destroyer or by a torpedo boat or two. A major operation might consist of 4 merchantmen escorted by a destroyer division. However, the urgency of access needs in North Africa caused by the suspension of traffic to Tripoli after the news of Force K's arrival, and caused by the growing success of British air and submarine forces, which in September 1941, for example, sank 13 merchantmen, grossing 65,000 tons. This caused for the Italian command for Submarine to arrange for an especially large convoy in early November. This they called Beta, and it had 5 steamers and 2 tankers. It was escorted by a pair of heavy cruisers and 2 destroyer divisions. That's 10 destroyers in total in this case. The escort was so strong because, of course, the Italians knew that there were cruisers in Malta, and they wanted to protect the convoy against any surface attack. But what they never figured was that the British would be able to locate the convoy at night. You remember, this is before the Italians really had much knowledge about radar. And while it's true that Ultra notified the Mediterranean fleet about Beta, and while it's true that a radar-equipped Wellington was supposed to guide Force K to contact, in fact, the news from Ultra didn't arrive until the convoy was already under attack, and the radar-equipped aircraft broke down. In this case, Force K attacked the convoy in the night of 9 November, based upon a traditional aerial sighting made the afternoon before, and by extremely good luck. However, once they were in contact, Force K made the best of their luck, sailing around the convoy, sinking all 7 steamers and tankers, sinking one of the escorting destroyers and severely damaging another one. The Italian cruisers were slow to react and failed to intervene effectively. The escort, the destroyers, mistook Force K for their own cruisers several times, and they aborted torpedo attacks that may or may not have made a difference. This is a map which kind of shows you what happened. You can see the British in white, and basically they just make a big loop around the convoy. The Italian cruisers are behind them. They follow them. They lose sight of them when they duck behind the convoy. The destroyers don't know what's going on. They think that those are their cruisers. They all take off to reorganize, and every ship was sunk. In short, the Italians really didn't have any sort of doctrine for fighting at night, and it showed. The British, on the other hand, had radar, and that helped. But I think their doctrine helped them even more. Basically, they played follow the leader. They always knew where the enemy was. They attacked warships first. They were very successful, and this was the result. I think it's one of the war's most brilliant naval actions, and it was the first in a series of British victories at sea over the next 5 weeks, most of which would be won by Force K. With submarine and air attacks also continuing, access imports into Africa plummeted. And in November, only 30% of the supplies actually shipped arrived. Of 21 convoys, 11 were attacked. Of 37 ships that sailed, 13 were sunk and 5 were damaged. This brought Britain to the very cusp of victory. Here's a simple graph that shows, well, that measures the Italian effort in terms of cargo delivered versus tonnage of shipping sunk. You can see that in July 1941, they were delivering about 2.5 tons of cargo for every gross registered ton of shipping sunk delivering that cargo. That's not particularly good. By September, it had dropped to about 1 to 1. But in November, it dropped to half a ton of cargo delivered for every ton of shipping sunk. And obviously, that's a completely unsustainable rate of loss. Then, on 18 November, the British launched their great offensive called Crusader. This was intended to secure, like I said, final victory in Africa. And Great Britain seemed on the cusp of winning that victory. And the reason why they were on the cusp was because they had seized sea control of the central Mediterranean. And that sea control basically was won by Force K, acting in conjunction with submarines and aircraft. So this is November 1941. However, the final Allied victory in Africa came in May 1943. This is 1.5 years later. So what happened? Well, some will say, perhaps most will say, that the Germans rushed to the rescue of the Italians and reopened the lines of supply by bombing the bejesus out of Malta. And yes, this was definitely a factor. Also a factor was that the British ground offensive that was supposed to be a rapid knockout punch instead turned into a toe-to-toe slugging match. But I believe the primary reason was because the Italian Navy won 3 major victories over the course of 2 days and grabbed sea control back from the British. And they did this weeks before the first German bomb fell on Malta. Literally, it transformed the campaign. The fateful day was December 17th. To say the situation had reached a crisis was putting it too mildly. On December 13, a pair of Italian cruisers, light cruisers, rushing an emergency supply of aviation fuel to Tripoli, had been sunk by Allied destroyers sailing from Gibraltar to Malta, reinforcements for the Mediterranean fleet. On the 15th, the Italians mustered and sailed a massive convoy called M41. This convoy consisted of 8 merchant ships and it was escorted by 4 battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. However, they had to abort this convoy that very same day before they had even left home waters, before some ships had even left port, when British submarines sank 2 of the steamers. 2 of the steamers collided and a submarine torpedoed an Italian battleship, Victoria Veneto. On the land front, the Axis forces, starved of munitions and fuel, finally cracked. On the 8th of December, Imperial forces finally relieved Tobruk, and on the 15th, the very day all this was happening, the Axis armies had to abandon their positions west of Tobruk and begin the long retreat back to Tripoli. In London, it was a time of optimism and hope. In Rome, it was a time of despair and gloom. In Alexandria, the commander of the Mediterranean fleet, Admiral Andrew Cunningham, thought that the Italian Navy had been sufficiently beat down to allow him to run a supply ship to Malta to replenish the island's diminished stocks of ammunition, torpedoes, and fuel oil. But in fact, however, the Italians persisted and they immediately launched another convoy operation called M42, minus the losses suffered the day before, 4 steamers, 3 battleships. Such prompt action caught the British by surprise, and the Italian and British escorts had a brief long-range clash just as night was falling on the 17th. This has gone down in history as the First Battle of Sirte. Very little damage was done, but for the Italians, the important thing was that their convoy continued. Wrong way. There we go. Here's a slide showing you battleship convoys. This is the Giulio escorting the liner Victoria. You can see the 90mm anti-aircraft guns on one side, the 12.6-inch rifles on the other. I should also add that Victoria was sunk the next month by a British torpedo bomber. It's a dangerous voyage, even with battleships escorting you. Anyway, on the following night, the Axis cargo ships carrying the munitions and tanks approached Africa. 1 ship peeled off for Benghazi, while 3 continued on to Tripoli. Fleet air-armed torpedo bombers attacked the Tripoli ships, but only succeeded in inflicting minor damage to 1 vessel. The British submarines were caught out of position. They were caught out of position by the speed with which the Italians had mounted another convoy operation after M41's failure. In Malta, Force K now consisting of 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers, under the theory that more is better, which was probably dubious in this case, hurriedly left port. They had just returned there after the actions in the central Mediterranean, hoping to intercept the convoy just east of Tripoli. I think the night of 18-19 December was one of the most complicated nights in naval history. And this map kind of gives you a little bit of a feel for that. On the far side, on the western side, you can see Force K's run from Malta down towards Tripoli. But on the other side of the map, kind of obscured by the little faces here, I want you to look at the track of the submarine Sirte approaching Alexandria. This is something that was happening kind of behind the back, as it were. But to return to Force K, there were several problems with their mission. First of all, their window of opportunity was only an hour or two. The weather was deteriorating, and they needed to operate close off the enemy coast, and they needed to clear that coast before daylight in order to avoid air attacks. Nevertheless, Vice Admiral Malta considered the prize too great to ignore. If his confidence in Force K's abilities are high, they were high, you know, he can be forgiven for this, I think. Force K had already engaged Italian convoys on 4 occasions, and they had racked up a score of 11 merchant ships and 2 destroyers sunk. The night of 18-19 December seemed like the moment of decision, and in fact it was. As the British force crossed the 100-fathom line, they ran into an unknown minefield, a deep minefield, laid 7 months before by Italian cruisers. The flagship, HMS Neptune, was mined 4 times and sank. Only 1 man from her crew of 763 men survived, was rescued 6 days later. 2 other cruisers were damaged, including Ajax, severely. The destroyer was sunk. Force K was effectively knocked from the fight. This was bad enough, but what happened that very same night in Alexandria was even worse. As the escort for the supply ships was returning to Alexandria, the harbor boom was open to give them passage. At that very moment, a trio of 2-man self-propelled torpedoes, crewed by Italy's elite naval commando force, Decima Flotilla Mas, were waiting outside the boom, considering how best to get inside. This shows an Italian 2-man sled, popularly called a human torpedo, but actually the vehicle for a detachable limpet mine you can see on the nose. In this painting, the mine is being clamped to Queen Elizabeth. Italy innovated the concept of naval commandos in the First World War and improved on the idea in the years before World War II. Rome envisioned what it called insidious warfare as a poor man's solution to the problem of facing the world's greatest naval power. They developed the technology, which included first practical underwater diving gear, the sleds they rode on, and the weapons they used. The Italian Navy had envisioned starting its war against the British Royal Navy with a massive sneak attack against all British Mediterranean bases before the enemy had any idea of the threat they faced. But Mussolini's precipitous rush to war scuttled the plan as the technology wasn't quite ready for use in June 1940. So although subsequent attacks, commando attacks against Gibraltar, bases in Crete, and a spectacular failure against Malta in July 1941 gave the British some idea of Italy's insidious warfare capabilities. And even though Ultra did provide some last-minute forewarning of the Alexandria attack, it still caught the British by surprise. All 3 of the commando teams found their targets, and they deposited powerful mines on or near them. The result was 2 battleships, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, flooded and knocked out of the war for 10 months in the case of Valiant and for 2 years in the case of Queen Elizabeth. A tanker and a destroyer were also severely damaged. By his own account, Admiral Cunningham had come out on deck of Queen Elizabeth wearing a coat over his pajamas, and the blast tossed him about 5 feet into the air. Thus, in one night, the British lost their cruiser strike force in Malta, their battle fleet in Alexandria. And this twin blow, combined with the fact that the German submarines had sunk a battleship and an aircraft carrier the month before, ended Britain's ability to control the central Mediterranean. Aircraft and submarines continued to operate out of Malta, but that just wasn't enough. The trend line of supplies delivered to Africa per GRT of shipping sunk, reversed itself, and started to improve. This was the turning point. The supplies delivered by the M42 convoy to Tripoli were rushed forward, and they gave Axis forces the strength needed to stabilize the front. I was looking at Clay Blair's Hitler's Submarine, or the Submarine Warfare book the other day, and in his preface, he talks about how it's necessary to quote numbers when you're talking about traffic wars, and he's sorry to bore people with numbers, but you know, I myself, I kind of like the numbers. This little chart gives you a view of how many tons of Axis tonnage was sunk versus how much tonnage of supplies were delivered in two periods. The first period in blue being the second half of 1941 from July through December. And in orange, you see the first half of 1942 from January through June 1942. And you can see 267,000 tons of shipping were sunk in the first period versus 326,000 tons delivered. Second period, 86,000 tons sunk versus 487,000 tons of shipping of cargo delivered. That's like about a 4-time improvement. Also in January, German air forces started bombing Malta heavily, and obviously the situation continued to improve for the Axis. Also, you got to consider that for the British, their Mediterranean affairs, their Mediterranean focus was overshadowed by the rush of other events. The good news was that the Soviets held on and did not collapse as so many in London expected. Even better, the United States entered the war, giving the British the hope and almost the certainty of final victory. But before final victory could come, there was still the war to be fought. And in the Mediterranean, the British had to fight without the direct assistance of their powerful new allies for most of the year. Now, I'm not going to give a blow-by-blow account of this campaign. For the most part, the year 1942 was difficult for the British. The situation at sea and an increasingly effective air campaign against Malta changed the British focus of the campaign from stopping Axis shipments to Libya to supplying Malta. This slide shows you the 4 Malta convoys that took place after January 1942. And the Italian Navy was able to intervene in all 4 of these. You can see the results. February, 3 ships sailed, 2 sunk, 1 turned back. That's the very first Malta convoy to be completely frustrated. And I should note that in the January 1941 through from the July 1941 through January 1942 period, only 1 British cargo ship sailing to Malta was sunk. So most of the ships arrived. Harpoon, or excuse me, Sirte, second Sirte, 4 ships sailed, 2 sunk. Harpoon and Vigorous, 16 ships sailed, 5 sunk, 9 turned back, and only 2 arrived. And the famous Pedestal convoy, which Churchill called that magnificent crash through of supplies, 14 ships sailed, 9 sunk, 5 arrived, 3 of which were damaged. I think in some respects, the Axis forces were just confirming what the British had already shown. The most effective way to stop enemy traffic in the Mediterranean involved the combination of and cooperation of surface, air, and submarine forces. One of these 3 elements was capable of winning a great victory, as the Beta convoy showed. But to prevail in the long grind of a campaign against traffic, the 3 elements working together were required in both the defensive and the offensive roles. So that brings us to our conclusion. what are the consequences of sea power? I think this whole episode gives a really dramatic example of why sea power is important in land operations. In April 1942, Rommel's Panzer Army Africa attacked once again and quickly regained all the ground lost in the Crusader offensive and more. The Axis forces captured Tobruk this time and drove into Egypt all the way to El Alamein, a railroad station just 60 miles west of the main naval base at Alexandria. The Mediterranean fleet departed for Palestine, Lebanon, and the Red Sea. However, the front stabilized at El Alamein, helped by the British ability to reinforce Egypt at will via the Red Sea, and helped by Rommel's long line of supply that stretched 1,100 miles back to Tripoli, and also helped by an increasingly more effective Allied use of ultra-intelligence. The Axis position in Africa was doomed once the British amassed a clear material superiority and counterattacked El Alamein in October 1942. And more importantly, in my belief, I believe, once the Anglo-Americans invaded French North Africa in November 1942. But still, even then, there was another 6 months of hard fighting on land, in the air, and sea ahead before Africa was finally conquered by Allied forces. And that's my talk. Thank you very much for listening. And I can take questions too, if anybody has any questions about this. And Jeremy, maybe we can go back and we can get rid of the screen share and go back to, oh, there we are, full view. So anybody have any questions?
Hey, Vince, I got one this time. What's the fourth victory? You got the minefield off of Tripoli, you have the Alexandria night, you have this first battle of Sirte. What's the fourth one?
I entitled the book Six Victories. And one of my pleasures in reading the reviews of this book is that most people have assigned different victories. Everybody has their victories that they take. So it's kind of ambiguous. These four victories, I think of it as Beta and the Sirte battle and the two mine actions, just because that's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
But there's lots of victories there. You could say there's like nine British victories and 7 Italian victories, but it's just kind of there for the reader to make of it what he will.
I was just wondering which ones you were meant to focus on, because that makes sense.
Yeah, that's what I focused on for this presentation.
Something I wanted to remark on that I noticed in reading it is that it seemed that the Italian Navy had a very good understanding to intercept logistics trains. We're more merchant ship focused than, say, the Japanese Navy usually was in something like that.
Yeah.
I think it's a valid comparison to make. I think the Italians and Japanese were presented with not dissimilar problems in the Solomons and in the Mediterranean, and they approached it in different ways. I think. I didn't talk about the Italian use of destroyers, for example, or submarines to carry cargo, and even cruisers. Oh, I mentioned that briefly. 2 cruisers were sunk. But they both had a similar problem. They approached it in slightly different ways. I think the Italians were more effective, in all honesty.
And that, yeah.
Otherwise, Guadalcanal would have lasted for 3 years.
Okay.
This is Mike Winger. I don't know how I bring my picture up. I guess tap on. I'm not going to worry about it. Sorry, we're making Christmas cookies.
Oh, that's what you're doing. I thought you were painting model soldiers or something.
No. Too bad we don't have smellophones instead of telephones.
Yeah, there you go.
But anyway, I think this it's interesting because I think there's the popular notion generally of total Italian ineptitude, and clearly that was not the case. They actually performed pretty well, I think, given the circumstances and the equipment they had. And I think there's the Italians can point with a great deal of pride to what they were accomplishing during this period. And this is an interesting way to challenge a popular notion and a myth that needs to be exploded. So
Well, I'll comment on that briefly. I think one of the things that got me so interested in the Mediterranean was when I was many years ago, 20 or 30 years ago, when I was reading about the Battle of Calabria in July 1940. And I read in every single source that I looked at that it established moral ascendancy over the Italians. And in the first place, I had no idea what moral ascendancy meant. I mean, for me, that was just kind of like, I didn't know. And I didn't understand how it was a British victory. I just didn't get it. And so that kind of led me down the path of reading more and more and more about the Mediterranean until I'm at the point now where I think the Italians did some things very well. They obviously lost the war. They obviously did some things very poorly, like everybody else. But as Mike said, they did some things very well. And I think in this particular case, I can't think of a single example in the course of World War II where it went from bad to good or light to dark, whatever your perspective is, where the situation changed so dramatically in the course of one day, where you went from losing a campaign to winning that campaign based upon the actions of naval forces, and not major naval forces, but mines. I mean, mines are pretty deadly weapon there. So, yeah, I appreciate your comments, Mike.
You know, something that I think drives the myth a little bit, just remembering one's own exposure as you've learned about the Italian Navy the first time. The Battle of Cape Matapan comes across as such a fiasco. It colors everything else till you learn about the other battles. And I'll bet that's where some of it comes. It's just a guess.
Well, it's Toronto and Matapan. Those are the two.
Yeah.
Those are the two. World-changing defeats that the Italians suffered, and after that, they were unable to do anything. But all of what I'm writing about takes place long after Matapan.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So,
exactly.
So what's that?
Yeah, but I want to push back now and say that in terms of their convoy operations, though, they never had the same operational research insight into their convoying actions to use larger convoys. I mean, yes, the battleship convoys were effective, but given Italy's incredibly constrained fuel situation, burning 10,000 tons of bunker fuel to move 54 Panzer IIIs over to Benghazi is not necessarily a very efficient use of one's fuel reserves. Why didn't they use larger convoys?
They didn't use larger convoys for one reason, one big reason. Tripoli could handle 4 or 5 cargo ships at one time. Benghazi could handle 2 or 3. Their whole convoy system was predicated upon sort of a ballerina dance, bringing the ships in and taking them out, bringing the ships in and taking them out. If they had brought in more ships, they just would have been sitting around and exposed as targets to British air attacks, because the British were bombing Tripoli pretty regularly at this time.
Yeah, 201 Squadron.
Yeah, so there were reasons why they didn't. The Beta convoy was a massive convoy. The M41 was a massive convoy, and these consisted of 7 ships.
Yeah.
And for the Italians, that was big time. And what uses most of the fuel oil is the battleships used all that fuel oil. The cruisers used all that fuel oil. The destroyers and the merchant ships were much less thirsty. Were much less made much less of a dent into their rapidly diminishing and disappearing reserves. So that's the big reason why.
Okay.
One very interesting resource that you guys might check out, providing you've got access to a federal document repository at some university somewhere, are the it's about 160 volume set called Sailing Directions. And this gives a description of every foot of shoreline in the world. And when it comes to a specific port, it tells exactly the equipment they have. Like they had derricks, and they had a crane, and they had a dock that was 100 feet long, and they couldn't supply fresh water, so you had to have your own. It's that kind of information that's just virtually you just can't find it anywhere else except in these sailing direction volumes. It's really fascinating. I've used that actually quite a bit in some of my writing. So that's just a hint. It's called Sailing Directions, and these are available on eBay too. You can buy them.
Well, thank you. I'll check that out.
Yeah.
The situation in Tripoli kept changing too, I might add. They would bring in floating cranes. They would bring in lighters. The cranes would get sunk or destroyed. The lighters would get sunk. So it was a process that continued. And it was really a back and forth process too, if you look at it on a day-by-day basis.
You can also, I'm sorry.
Vince,
Yes,
Vince, can I toss something in?
yes.
Just want to go, sorry, I just showed up at the last minute, so maybe talk about some things you talked about before, but a couple of comments. First one is rightfully you pointed out that the port capacity was the main limitation of the Italians. But interestingly enough, they made that decision in 1940. If you go back and check the history, they decided to increase the port capacities in the Adriatic, what they considered to be the main front. They spent their money there rather than on North Africa. And all the way through the North African battles, they never made much effort to actually increase the port capacity, which they did in the Adriatic. And if you look at the Pacific and others, if you look at the way the Americans approached things, of course, was quite different. They looked at it from a logistical standpoint. One of the things they recognized they always had to do was find a way to deal with the logistics of moving stuff ashore, which the Italians didn't do, and I think a lot of other navies didn't. So they made the decision early on, never changed that, which meant they always had to use small convoys and all the other issues that you have along the way. That's part one.
Oh, part one. Okay. What's
And
part
then
two?
part two, just as a comment here, is we talk about, you talked about early on the British comment of having won the first battles in establishing moral ascendancy and so on and so forth. All this propaganda that's gone on through the years, we're now seeing it from a slightly different perspective. For example, they talked about how they control the central Mediterranean and so forth largely in 1940 and 41. In reading the naval staff history on the Mediterranean, they talk about they only actually spotted one Italian convoy in 1940.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't have the capacity, or better said, they didn't want to expend the energy, or that wasn't a main element for them in 1940, even though all these post-war histories suggest, in the English language suggest, they had all this moral ascendancy, but they really didn't.
Yeah, let me comment on your comment.
Okay.
First of all, I did mention that in 1940 there was no plans to fight in Africa. There were plans to invade Yugoslavia, but realistically speaking, the Balkans are far more important to Italy than North Africa is.
Yep.
So I really can't fault the decision to beef up the Adriatic ports, the Albanian ports, which are not, the center of commerce and activity in the 1940s. And the second point about the British priorities, it's true. They didn't put much effort into trying to find shipping. They didn't know where to look, and that was all kind of like a blank book to the British in the first half of 1940. But I think that just shows you what the priorities were.
I think another part that Lonnie touched on was the written history in English was largely taken from the British side, and that had been, I'll call it, tainted with an awful lot of propaganda that wasn't scrubbed out after the war. So we were still reading things that were very pro-British and downplayed any damage the Italians did. And I remember a book written by a guy named Sadkovich coming out in the late 90s, I think.
Yeah.
Mike Yaklich and I were on a B&B bulletin board, and there was a considerable discussion about how reliable his information was, but it definitely shook everybody and sent us back to go look and see if everything we were reading was even realistic. And then, of course, there's been a flood of books since then to kind of change it.
Sadkovich's book was kind of made an impression on me. I think, Bud, you were trying to ask a question?
Yeah, Vince, fascinating discussion. I wonder if in addition to the analysis that you've done so far, you've been able to draw any conclusions about the relative capabilities of the naval commanders, flotilla and fleet commanders, British versus Italian? We've read a lot about Cunningham, but not much about anybody else, I think.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point. You read a lot about Cunningham, you read a lot about Vian, you read a lot about, you know, even guys like Captain Mack and whatnot. The Italian commanders, Icino, or however you pronounce that in Italian, don't receive a lot of press. He actually commanded more battleship actions in World War II than any other admiral did. And, you know, he's always depicted as a hard luck commander. I think that in the Beta Convoy action is a good example. I think that the Italian leadership was confused and indecisive. The cruisers were seeking certainty. They wanted clarity before they reacted, and clarity just wasn't there. The destroyers wanted to find out what was happening. So basically they abandoned the merchant ships and went off and reorganized. And I think that that's indicative of people. Well, I put it down to doctrine, and I think that there were some problems with Italian doctrine at that point. They were doing something they really didn't want to do, and that was defending merchant ships with large warships. And they didn't really know how to do it. People make a big deal about radar, how radar did this, or how radar did that. Radar didn't do much of anything in the Beta Convoy action, for example. I mean, Ajax set her later guns by radar for the opening salvos, but that was basically it. And Penelope didn't even use her radar because she was getting all these just so off. So I think that,
yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I think the point is that the Italians were tactically inferior in many of these actions, but I think they got better as time went on. And even by 1943, I can cite two examples of Italians protecting a convoy at night against larger British destroyers and actually saving the convoy. So they continued to have big defeats all the way through 42, but they also had some victories in 43. So I think basically the British were better tactically.
A parallel in not using radar effectively, of course, could have been some of the early U.S. Navy actions around Guadalcanal too.
Well, who used radar effectively in 1942? You tell me.
USS Washington.
Say a couple of things I'd like to interject. When you're looking at the entire 3-year period of logistical efforts to support North Africa, or their forces in North Africa, first thing I just point out is, the Italians started out the war with about 3.3 million tons of merchant shipping, and about a third of their merchant fleet was caught outside of the Mediterranean at the beginning of the war. Mm-hmm. So that was lost. And add injury to insult, most of that merchant shipping ended up in Allied hands eventually and was used against the Axis. So they had a fleet of a little over 2 million tons of merchant shipping, and that was a wasting asset because they really didn't have a way to regenerate it. Because as Vince was talking about earlier, they didn't have the industrial capacity to build large numbers of merchant ships, and they can only replace a trickle of what they had lost. And they were able to get some, from the French later on, to confiscate French ships. But basically, they were dealing with a wasting asset throughout this entire campaign. And I think somebody also mentioned the whole fuel oil situation that was plaguing them. So, as you look at this thing, you have to realize the Italians were constantly dealing with resources that were being depleted. And then the second thing I'll just throw out there is when you're looking at the logistical situation in North Africa, part of it was, the sea lanes, but also part of it was going on the ground. And again, Vince kind of talked about this a little bit too. Sometimes it's referred to as like a rubber band. One side would go on the offensive and they would stretch out to a point where they were overextending their ground logistical, and that would put them at a disadvantage. And then like when the British were at El Alamein, only 60 miles away from Alexandria, well, they're close to the logistical bases where Rommel was 1,100 miles away from Tripoli, and vice versa. So it's referred to as a rubber band. So when you're looking at the logistical situation, part of it is dealing with the sea lanes, but part of it was also looking at the logistical constraints that were going on the ground in North Africa.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that. Everything you said is true. The situation with shipping is one that's being debated. I'm looking forward to receiving a new book right now by a gentleman named Hammond based on his thesis about, I think he's saying that shipping was the biggest problem the Italians faced. I kind of disagree with that, although I haven't read his book yet, so maybe I'm premature here. I think fuel oil was the biggest single limitation the Italians faced. They basically ran out of fuel oil, and it was hand to mouth by the first quarter of 1942. The amount of shipping they took from Yugoslavia and from Vichy France, I hate that word, from the French state, was actually pretty considerable. And given the fact that their shipping requirements continued to shrink throughout the campaign, even in the dark days of May 1943, they had enough ships to run the supplies they could run to Africa. There was no use for any more shipping, I believe. On the other hand, there was a tremendous amount of shipping required for the islands, for the Adriatic. I mean, most of the Italian supplies transported overseas went to Albania. I mean, by far and away, the vast majority. So we kind of elevate the importance of Africa in all of this. But in my humble opinion, there was really no reason for the British. Every reason for the British to protect the Middle East, but there was not that much reason to fight in North Africa. Every day fought in Africa was a good day for the Axis, I think. And of course, this might be slightly controversial, but the Italians had enough shipping, I believe, to supply Africa. And that might even be a good theme for a 1943 book. We shall have to see.
I ain't gonna write it.
John, you're almost done with 1942.
No, I'm not.
Vince, Ralph Norton here. Two thoughts and a question. First thought is, I had an uncle who was a career merchant mariner covering the war years. They never thought of them. They knew when it push came to shove, they would never be anything except expendable. They accepted that. Second was, wouldn't it be an interesting history if the Italians knew Libya was one of the biggest oil fields in the world? And then the question I have, you mentioned the effect of 2-3 victories on a major campaign. In this particular front, how much was that impacted by the fact that the total number of ships involved was relatively small to the other fronts? I mean, a loss of a few ships in the Pacific would have hardly been noticed, or even North Atlantic. Here, a couple of cruisers was a big percentage of the force. How much was that a factor? Thank you.
You know, I never really looked at it in that way. I tend to suspect that obviously the fewer moving parts there are, when one moving part gets broken, it has a bigger impact. And there were fewer moving parts perhaps in the Mediterranean, central Mediterranean than there were in the Pacific. So in that sense, I think you have a point. I also think though that you know, there are tipping points, and I think this was a tipping point for whatever reason. I think the Churchill's desire to put surface ships in Malta was right. The Pound and Cunningham, who were against it, were also right, because those ships were eventually destroyed. And it didn't take that long to destroy them. You know, less than 2 months. So you know, there's a lot of moving parts there. But I don't know if I answered your question or not. But I think that regardless, I think it was still, you know, I think it was very important, regardless of the number of ships involved.
I agree with you. I'm just saying that with fewer total ships, that tipping point was much more delicate.
I'd interject too and just say, if you look at the number of warship losses that occurred in the Mediterranean during 41 in particular, I mean, it's the biggest killing field on the planet in terms of surface warfare. And certainly the losses for the British were not inconsiderable. I mean, Barham gets destroyed, Indomitable gets wrecked. Valiant and Queen Elizabeth are, you know, sitting on the bottom until they scrape.
Royal sunk.
Yeah, you know, for all intents and purposes, masquerading as sunk. So, yeah, I feel like the losses, particularly to the Royal Navy during 41 in the Mediterranean, were extremely serious.
Yeah, Mountbatten may have sent a very unenviable record himself, losing ships.
Well, I think moving part comment kind of misses it. It's not that one part breaks, it's, is there another part that will cover for it? And the Italians did a pretty good job of making up for their losses and keeping things moving so that even in 1943, they couldn't be dismissed. I think the British had some trouble there because they were stretched all over the world and couldn't replace some of the losses they took.
Good point. Thank you.
A general point about the bigger picture here, and that I mean Vince is totally right that there are these four battles, and they are, some of them are a real turning point. But there are bigger things going on. Namely, Japan attacks Malaya, and 2 weeks after these relatively small actions, the British use the Prince of Wales and the repulse, and their whole strategic position is wrecked by forces outside the Mediterranean. And at the same time, another element that's going on here, aside from the Italian Navy, which, no disrespect to the Italian Navy, but the Germans arrive, German U-boats arrive for the first time in the autumn of 1941, and Barm is sunk by a German U-boat. One of the failings of the Italian Navy is their submarine force, which is effective. I mean, aside from the midget submarines, which are extremely effective, but the conventional submarines, both against warships and against merchant shipping, are pretty ineffective. So what you have is, it's like, from the British point of view, there's this double whammy. Also, a whole German Flieger Corps is sent south from Moscow in November of 1941, which possibly had quite important results there. So I'm just really saying that there is this larger situation, which it's a kind of perfect storm from the British point of view.
Well,
Yeah.
I think just to reiterate what you're saying there, and you just mentioned a little bit before about the heavy losses that were suffered here. And I've never actually done the analysis to break it down, but I think the majority of those losses the British suffered in the Mediterranean were actually suffered at the hands of the Germans and not the Italians.
Of course they were.
Particularly the Luftwaffe was devastating in this confined area, and then the U-boats came in later on. So by 1942, Britain's main opponent in the Mediterranean was not the Italian fleet, it was the Luftwaffe.
Well,
And that was true of a lot of those convoy battles too. It was aircraft and it was submarines that were doing the damage. It wasn't surface ships. I can only think of one principal British warship that was sunk by an Italian, well, no, a couple, I guess, that were sunk by Italian warships during the course of the Mediterranean campaign. Most of the losses they sustained were at the hands of the Germans.
Yeah, if you look at my book, there's a table that lists every single ship that was lost and who sank it and how it was sunk. So there's no dispute about that. It's a combination of factors. But one of the points I was trying to make with the Malta convoy slide towards the end of the presentation is that you have surface ships intervening against convoys, you have submarines, and you have aircraft. All three together are the way to go. I think the Vigorous convoy is a perfect example of how you can have a major impact and not sink a single ship. You have a major convoy heading towards Malta. You have Italian battleships steaming to intercept it. They are going to intercept it. There's no question if the convoy continues. So what does the convoy do? It turns back and never reaches Malta. So that's an example of how you can have a profound impact on a campaign, but you don't have to sink ships to do it. I mean, sinking ships is a wonderful way of keeping score, and it's something that you automatically keep track of, but it's just one component in a larger picture, I believe. And in the Mediterranean, the picture was how to supply two separate points, one point being Malta, and the other point being Libya, North Africa. And the third point being obviously Egypt. And that campaign lasted as longest campaign in World War II, as far as I can tell. So why did it last so long? Why wasn't it not a quick victory? Why did it last so long? It wasn't because of just the fact that the Germans happened to send submarines to the Mediterranean in September 1941, or they sent a whole Flieger Corps down in November of 1941. It was also the fact that it was being waged by the Italian efforts. And the Italian efforts were major. They were bigger than what people commonly think they were. And that's not to dispute that the Germans sank more ships than the Italians. Of course they did. That's not to dispute that if they had fought by themselves against the British, they probably wouldn't have lasted as long as they did with German help. although they did last fairly long by themselves. You know, it's an interesting question, and I would be happy to debate anybody, you know, about it at any time, and I would learn a lot in the process, because, you know, obviously there's still things to learn.
Well, even
Vince?
in 1953, the Italian fleet still exists. It's still a force in being, and everybody on the Allied side has to plan around the fact that there, you know, 3 or 4 battleships and aircraft and all this stuff, and it's still all extant. I mean, it's useful. So they haven't really destroyed the Italian fleet. It's a major factor in all their planning.
Yeah, they sank most of the destroyers, and cruiser force is pretty depleted, but the battleships were still there. That's true, and they had to account for them. And somebody else had a question. It was
Yeah,
Tony.
I wanted to ask, speaking of Italian influence, when the British lifted and interrogated the frogmen and captured some of the males of the pigs at Alexandria that attacked the 2 battleships, did that influence in any way the X-craft attack on Tirpitz?
Well, yeah. I mean, the British were just like, hey, this is great stuff, and they proceeded to copy it.
So it is a copy of it. It's not parallel development.
Well, they cooperated. They cooperated. The British and the Italians cooperated after the armistice, after September 43.
Yeah, well,
they sent joint teams out to sink Italian warships that had been captured by the Germans.
Well,
And
Tirpitz was attacked. Well, originally it was attacked by the main attack was by the X-craft, which was a mini submarine.
Yeah. Those are not two-man.
Those are not human
sleds.
torpedoes,
Yeah.
but the British developed the Chariot human torpedo, which they utilized against the Italians then, which was, you know, so yes, they I don't know if did they have that in development beforehand, or was that just a result of
There was some tied to a failed attack with them.
That was secret technology when it was introduced. That was revolutionary stuff. Nobody was doing that. You know, people fault the Italians, for example, for not developing sonar or radar. And my whole point is that you develop the tools that you think you're going to need in the times of peace before the war starts. So the Italians are looking at the British Royal Navy, which is, like I said, the most powerful navy in the world. I admit that, Evan. And what are they going? How are they going to stop it? They think radar is some sort of targeting device, and they're already pretty proud of their fire control. But, you know, naval commandos, that's you know, pretty innovative stuff, I think. So
it carried over from World War I, you know, Amphibious Unitas, you know.
Yeah. It was effective then too.
Yeah.
Can you talk
The
a little
Italians,
about
the Italians do seem to miss out on air power, though. I mean, they do invent many submarines, but the Italian Navy is, I think, singularly almost as bad as the Royal Navy in terms of developing carrier air power, and I think cooperation between the Navy and the Italian Air Force is also poor. And I think the British are better than that, combining land-based air and their ships, which is why Malta is so important. But I agree, it is remarkable that the Italians developed that technology, and that it isn't a cause of more alarm elsewhere, given that that kind of weapon is used in the First World War. Of course, the British did the same thing in Kronstadt in 1919 when they attacked the Bolshevik Navy using torpedo boats.
Let me answer Terry's question, but first, I would comment on. No, I can't remember what I was going to comment on. Terry, what was your question?
So can you comment on the tactical effectiveness of airborne torpedo launching, torpedoes from aircraft? Both sides use them in the Mediterranean.
Can I comment on the effectiveness?
Yeah.
Well, I think that slide showing that 30, I can't even remember my own number, 39 ships were hit by Italian torpedoes in 1941 means that they were effective. It was the best weapon the Italians had. But, you know, it wasn't that effective. Most attacks failed. It was very dangerous. Those guys suffered heavy losses. I think the Italian Air Force, the way they cooperated with the Navy, especially in the first year, was just horrible. I mean, Evan made that point, and it was probably worse than horrible. But I also have to ask, how long would an aircraft carrier, an Italian aircraft carrier, have survived in the Mediterranean? I don't think it would have lasted very long. And British carriers didn't last that long. I see no reason why an Italian carrier
It would have drawn too
last
much
any longer.
attention. Yeah.
The British carriers were also sunk by either German bombers or by U-boats. I think without exception.
Didn't an
Not by
Italian bomber?
Italian, not by Italian.
An Italian
not by
bomber
Italian
put a
aircraft.
bomb on my brain is so dead. January
Indomitable.
1941. Huh? Indomitable. Yes. Check it out.
I think it's
An Italian torpedo plane hits Nelson.
Well, a lot of
It's
the,
Nelson.
that is true. Yeah.
Yeah.
a lot of the attacks accredited to the Germans weren't done by the Germans. They were done by Italians flying German aircraft, especially Stukas.
They were well Stukas, but they're also done by Italian aircraft flying Italian aircraft that were credited as being German aircraft by British reports, and that's how they're in the history.
Yeah, I know. Everything was an 88 when they got
I can give you
shot
several
at.
examples of that if you're curious. So it's not as bad.
I was
The
actually
big point is the Germans did do much better in the air than the Italians. That is the big point. And it's true.
Vince, can you talk a little bit about German-Italian cooperation and coordination? Conventional wisdom is that was poor overall. And I think in your book, you do mention, I don't recall whether the German bombing in Malta was actually coordinated with what the Italians were doing. Can you talk a bit about the coordination?
Yeah, I can talk about that. The coordination, the Italians had tapped the phones in the German embassy, and that's how they got their best information about German activities and what they were doing. There was a lot of, I hate to repeat a trite statement, but there was a lot of German contempt for Italian capabilities. And this is pretty well documented. You can read the period literature and it comes through crystal clear. There was a lot of Italian resentment against German arrogance and interference. But that said, on the lower levels, the Italians and the Germans knew that they were doing the same job, and there was a lot of effective cooperation. You have to dig to find it, and it's not well publicized, but it is there. I think the cooperation at the higher levels tended to be very suspicious. The Italians did everything they could to keep Germans out of Submarine. They finally let them in towards the end, but could have been a lot better. The British and the Americans could have taught them lessons about cooperation, even though the British and American cooperation sometimes was just not that good. It was much better than what the Axis powers were able to put together. And that's one of the faults of their particular system of their particular political systems, if you forgive the comment. I think that operating in environments of secrecy and everybody has their own private empire, there's cooperation will suffer. Lower levels better, higher levels not so great.
I was just going to interject with regards to that cooperation, though, that it's Lorzer's Flieger Corps 2 that goes after Malta to start off with in April. And from what I read, it's pretty clear that they were cooperating with the Italians in Sicily, and it was a joint operation to shut Malta down. So again, at the tactical level, it would seem that there was at least some degree of cooperation between the tactical units.
Although the Italian attacks were like, the volume of Italian attacks were like 1/10 the German attacks.
Yeah, I was going to say like 1 to 4, something like that. Yeah. Flieger Corps 2 is doing the heavy lifting.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah. You're muted, Evan.
Evan, we can't hear you.
Evan, you're muted.
Sorry. No, the Italian Air Force is more important in 1942. It sustains the attacks on Malta, and it's very important in the 1942 convoy battles. A lot of the German aircraft are fighting, supporting Rommel in Egypt. So the volume of German help goes down at that stage.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, are you done? Or are you?
Yeah, sorry. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, when you're looking at the volume of air attacks against Malta, I mean, during the periods of time, there were, when the Luftwaffe first shows up in 1941 and is bombing, Malta is having an impact, and then the Luftwaffe goes away because Germany invades Russia. And for the second half of 1941, Malta is pretty much able to do what they want to do. And then in the first half of 1942, the Luftwaffe returns and is pounding the heck out of Malta. Just huge volumes of tonnage is being dropped, but they can't sustain that. And by the second part of the year, again, when it's turned over primarily just to the Italians, the amount of tonnage you're able to drop is just more or less a nuisance type of a thing. And it really, really took a constant, the fact that they failed to invade Malta, they just couldn't keep it down, because as soon as the bombing would let up, the Malta would start to come back again.
A part of that was due to the fact that a lot of those aircraft were being transferred to Fliegerführer Africa because they needed the tactical air support for Gazala. So that's why, the bombing offensive against Malta is really hot and heavy during April and May. But by the end of May, those assets have been moved down to the area of Gazala. So,
yeah. And of course, it was Rommel, because they did have a plan to invade Malta. And well, I guess Hitler never was keen on the whole idea, because, he was still stung from the losses they'd suffered at Crete. And Rommel basically said, hey, I got the British on the run. We don't need to worry about Malta.
Malta, Operation C was one of the few instances where Italians, Germans, and Japanese together participated in planning of operation. Trivia.
Yep, it's true.
Interesting.
Something I think that people don't realize when they're thinking about the Germans and the Italians, but a couple people have brought it up here, is how often the Germans really weren't there for air support. I mean, they weren't there at all navally until September 1941. The Italians have been fighting there since June 1940. They didn't even get motor torpedo boats operational there until I think it was December of 41. And their Air Force shows up in January 41, vanishes for the Eastern Front mostly by June of 41, comes back
temporarily.
Yeah, eventually, only at the end of the year. So there's a big stretches where the Italians were doing all the heavy lifting, including in the air, and they had no sea help at all. So while I got the stage, I wanted to make comments on many other people's comments, if you indulge me. Something Professor Maudsley said regarding the overall situation. Between September 41, when Nelson gets torpedoed by an Italian plane, and the Alexandria night when the two battleships get sunk by the piloted torpedoes, that's 5 battleships and a battle cruiser the British lose in that 3-month stretch. 3 are out for good, and Barham is sunk, Prince of Wales, Repulse are all sunk. The other 3 are out for long periods of time. So yeah, that even the biggest navy in the world, when you lose 6 battleships or 6 capital ships cumulatively in a 3-month stretch worldwide, you're going to be hurting a little bit. Something John Parcells had said earlier, the one area where I think their operational research and lessons learned really fell down was in and Vince alluded to this during the talk, was in the convoy protection, and especially nighttime convoy protection by surface ships. I mean, in April, you have the Tarago convoy gets completely wiped out by British destroyers from Malta that were only there temporarily. Then in November, they still haven't worked out how to stop a repeat on a larger scale from happening with Beta. So one other thing I wanted to say was about the convoy, the ports in North Africa. They may not have developed them extensively pre-war because of reasons that have come out here, but they were indeed trying to bulk up their capacity continually during the war. I mean, Cavallero has when he on the eve of Gazala writes about how much they improved the port capacity at Benghazi, but you also have to remember Benghazi changes hands like 4 times. And everybody that leaves does extensive demolitions. Yes. So now you've got to almost rebuild your port facilities over again. My last comment, I haven't talked in all these meetings, so I'm getting it all out now. My last comment is that in terms of the Italian leadership in the naval war being less studied, I'm waiting for the biography of Arturo Riccardi.
Yeah.
This guy is the head honcho for the Italian Navy, who, as you know, we've seen here, is a relatively important player, at least in the Mediterranean. and he's there for most of the war when Italy was really contesting, like from December, he would last what, December 40 to I guess he didn't go down until Mussolini fell in July, so 43, and he's like a cipher. Nobody speaks about Riccardi. I think, from what I can see, that he was a fairly competent individual. He was more, you know, the way the Italians divided it, the chief of staff of the Navy wasn't really the guy who ran operations in the Navy. He interacted with the other services and was the head guy. Basically, the deputy chief, Sansonetti, most of the war, did the actual operational control of the Navy at sea and the operational planning. And Riccardi mostly signed off on that. So he was a kind of a higher level guy with higher level concerns. But I'd really love to see something about him out there. So many naval historians on this list. Somebody make me happy. That's all I've got to say.
Yes. And the other admiral that fought the Battle of Panatelia was also quite a good commander at sea. The name escapes me.
Dazzara.
Pardon me?
Dazzara.
No. My brain. Anyway, I don't want to get hung up on that. Is there any more questions? We've been going now for an hour and 20 minutes, and I'm happy to continue as long as people are interested. We are recording this, and we are going to post it on our YouTube channel, which we now have. And we've been getting some good hits on that. Yeah, you know. John, you're past 1,300 hits now on your presentation. So, you know, people are watching this stuff. So I want to keep it light and entertaining. And
You're doing a very good job.
Thank you, Ralph. Are there any more questions?
I was going to interject a factoid regarding
good.
relative competency of Italian submarines, that the highest scoring non-German submarine during the war is not a British sub or an American sub. It's the Leonardo da Vinci.
Yeah.
So,
operating in the Atlantic.
Yeah, 120,000 tons of shipping or something like that.
Yeah, I think the whole question of Italian submarines is one that I'm not prepared to speak authoritatively on right now, but I think that there are a lot of things to be studied in that whole equation. If you look at the British submarine campaign in the Mediterranean for the first year of the war, you'll see that they didn't accomplish very much. And even throughout the entire course of the war, they averaged, what, 20,000 tons of shipping sunk per submarine sunk. And that compares to what the Americans in the Pacific, somewhere about 90,000 tons per one. And the Germans, what were they? Number escapes me, it was somewhere 50 to 60,000 tons per sunk per submarine loss. So
that seems high.
Well, it could be high. You can look it up and call me out on that. But it is something, a number I was working with not that long ago. So it's in the ballpark.
Well, and
The Italians.
took a lot of casualties in the course of doing that damage too. I mean, I think I was just reading about the U-class submarines. They lost 12 of 15 of those during the war, and most of them in the Med.
Well, the Mediterranean was a brutal place to have a submarine war. I think that's the whole point. And the Italians suffered, and the British suffered, and the Germans did okay. But you know, the Germans didn't do that good. There wasn't that much traffic. There wasn't.
Well, yeah, Donitz was railing against the fact that he's got all these subs skulking around in the Mediterranean when he wants
basically doing nothing. You know, popping off an occasional battleship and aircraft carrier, but still, you know, a couple merchant ships, maybe more than a couple, but there weren't that many to sink. They tried to stop the traffic between Alexandria and Tobruk, for example. They had several submarines trying to interdict that traffic, and they had some successes, but overall they didn't really impact it that much.
But the British submarines have some notable success during the German invasion of Norway, damaging some of the warships. Kind of no less than 3, I think. Let's see, Karlsruhe, they damaged the Scheer, and they sink the Karlsruhe. They damaged the Scheer, they damaged the Gneisenau. Yeah. And there's one other, I think. But yeah, and then they had some luck against Japanese cruisers, you know, later in the war in 44 and 45. But that's what I best remember the British subs doing.
Yeah, well, I'm no expert in submarine warfare, but I do know that if you're going to have successful submarine warfare, you need targets. And one thing that the Allies could provide the Germans was targets. And they had lots and lots of targets. One thing the Japanese could provide the Americans was targets. Len, do you know what the ratio of German subs sunk? That number. Do you remember that?
I don't remember off the top of my head, Vince. You've been looking at the subchapter more recently than I have.
I'm writing about U-boats right now, so here's Clay Blair's, tome. I should.
Yeah, Clay Blair.
Real time.
You could probably
I'm
get.
gonna read a good book about U-boats. Of course, it's not 1942, so maybe I should forget it. I just picked up a copy of Total Undersea Warfare by Hamilton, and he talks about the late warfare, 1944 forward, and the super submarines and the snorkel. And it's a fascinating book. 60,000 hours to put a rubber coating on your sub? I don't know. So
I think the Italian submarines in the Atlantic got a lot of German training, and that improved their doctrine a great deal, and therefore they were much more successful than the ones that stayed back in the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
I think at one point, the Italians had more submarines in the Atlantic than the Germans did in like 1940, latter part of 1940, maybe beginning of 1941. Altogether, I think the Italian submarines in the Atlantic sunk about 500,000 tons, which was a pittance compared to what the Germans eventually sank, but it was still a much better record than what the Italians had in the Mediterranean. But there's certainly an argument that the Italians would have been better off to have kept their submarines in the Mediterranean and let the Germans kept their U-boats in the Atlantic. From a strategic access point of view, that probably would have made more sense.
There's some other.
It's important to realize that the Italian submarine fleet is the biggest in the world when the war, aside from the Russian submarine fleet, when the war starts. And it's kind of paradoxical that it's so unsuccessful, but certainly they were world leaders in developing submarines. The other thing you might think about is how much bigger the Italian Navy is than the German Navy. That in terms of conventional warships, the Italians start out, with essentially a complete navy, a balanced navy at all levels, including a very large submarine force. The Germans start out with almost nothing, and they lose what they have in Norway. So in a way, there is a kind of, although I think that the Italian Navy gets underrated, and there's a lot of British propaganda about the Italians do actually start out with quite an effective looking fleet, and yet it's unsuccessful.
Is it? What are they trying to accomplish?
Well, what they do effectively is they do supply North Africa successfely in terms of small convoys. Yes. So that kind of actions involving destroyers and torpedo boats and small numbers of merchant ships, that on the whole is pretty successful. But given that they have, the Italians have two completely modern battleships, right? No modern British battleship goes into the Med until late 1941. They have four extensively modernized battleships. It is surprising that given the forces they have, they aren't more successful.
Well, again, that's a question of definitions, I think, and I think we have to base the Italian performance based upon the definitions that they were trying to. What were they trying to accomplish? And the whole one of the big criticisms of the Italian Navy is the fact that they embraced the fleet and being mission, if you will, and that they're not taking their ships out there and engaging in naval battles, this, that, and the other. And I'm not convinced that that's a valid criticism, in all honesty.
Well, I think
the Italian leaders came in to this. There's a famous letter from Cavagnari from April or May, just before Mussolini joins the war, telling him why, from the Navy's point of view, he shouldn't be getting into this. But he stated consistently, including even in joint planning with the Germans, such as it existed back in 39, that the Italian Navy was going to fight a defensive war. And it gets criticized a lot for not striking out because of that strength that you mentioned, because they did have a fairly large and balanced Navy, although it's only the third largest in Europe, and the other two are on the other side, the British and the French. and the Italian in their pre-war planning have to consider that they're fighting two navies bigger than themselves in their main war scenario. So, you know, there is that, but yeah, I think they framed their task defensive, and their main defensive task was getting their convoys through and protecting Italy's own shorelines. You could argue that maybe they didn't do that. They got nicked at Toronto and things like that, but I'm kind of supporting what Vince said here. I think if you look at it from what they were trying to accomplish, rather than what their allies, the Germans, or their opponents, the British, thought they should have been trying to do. I'm not saying that that's necessarily correct, but by their own sights, they were fairly successful at what they were setting out to do. Now, you can make a very good case for at least the first year of the war, with virtually no German assistance, that they were totally winning the convoy war to North Africa. Up till June, they sink something like 14 enemy submarines on that route and deliver anywhere from 94 to 98% of everything they shipped. So they're, you know, it's a complex question.
Well, it is, but they did a good job of doing what they kind of set out to do. And I think people are kicking them because, oh, they should have done this. No, I think they did a very smart thing. You know, at the end of 1943, when they flop over on the other side, they still have a fleet that sails to Malta with their flags up and parks in Malta. So, you know, they didn't fail. It's just that they had a totally different goal than the British thought they should have.
Well, I think it's just worth pointing out that you know, when Italy goes to war in 1940, who knows what they were really trying to accomplish? Basically, Mussolini declares war because he figures that, you know, France is almost conquered by the Germans, and Britain's going to fall, and he's going to be able to show up at the, you know, at the negotiating table and be successful there. I'm not sure what the Italian, you know, strategic plan was, other than the fact that we want to be in on the kill. And when Britain doesn't die the way Mussolini anticipates they are, then the Italians are stuck trying to figure out what it is that we're trying to accomplish.
And hence the campaign in North Africa. I think you're completely right there, right? Yes. Yes.
Not only that, but Mussolini has to consider too the question of what is Italy's place going to be in a Europe if Hitler does win the war in May or June or the summer of 1940, and he stayed out of it.
Right.
Yeah.
I think he makes some kind of comment like, "I just need 10,000 casualties to have a seat at the negotiating table."
Yeah. I need a few thousand dead to bring to the conference table. Well, he got that.
So the whole thing is kind of I don't want to say it's an accident, but it's just they're kind of making it up as they're going along. And so we can't look at this from the vantage point. They had some great strategic plan, because they didn't. It was just, again, I think most of his service chiefs were advising not to go to war, and Mussolini did it anyway. So now they're at war. What are we going to do? I mean, he had to constantly prompt his people to take the offensive in Africa, and so on and so forth, because they didn't really have a strategic plan.
Well, Badoglio, who was the chief of general staff, he's supposed to, Mussolini puts him in there to prepare for the wars he's going to fight, and Badoglio thinks Italy can't fight a major war against a major power and win. So he's dragging his heels trying to keep them out of war, and he basically lets the three service chiefs decide for themselves what they're going to do in the event of war, which is how you get the Navy. And a defensive plan, whether that served Italy's long term, I agree 100%. There was no strategic.
I think it's also fair to just point out, because, you know, we talk about, you know, this and that. In 1940, particularly, you know, the British weren't strong in the Mediterranean either. So the fact that the British weren't able to take advantage of this Italian, I mean, the British were heavily outnumbered in the first year of the Mediterranean conflict. And the fact that the Italians were able to, you know, do some of the things they were able to do is because, you know, Malta was pretty much defenseless at the beginning of the war. And, you know, there's just not a lot of British forces in there. So it's going to take time for Britain to build up their forces, you know, in the Mediterranean too. So it's not like Britain was necessarily prepared for this war in the Mediterranean in 1940 themselves.
They wanted to fight a naval war in the Mediterranean in 1940, and they had reason to believe that they could win a naval war in the Mediterranean in 1940.
Particularly,
I think that's a fact that can be established pretty easily. Sam, you had a question. You haven't been able to ask it.
I was going to give us another direction and ask, did Italy ever try to develop any amphibious warfare capabilities? It would seem to me that if your focus is the Adriatic, Yugoslavia, Albania, if your focus is France and perhaps even Malta, you would want to develop some sort of amphibious capabilities because you're not expecting great surface actions involved in those, at least not 1940.
The San Marco Marine Brigade, they had specialized landing ships, which were basically, they had ramps off either side where you walk down to the beach. But they didn't have a whole, they developed motorized barges and they had some, but it wasn't anywhere on the scale that you're associating with amphibious warfare when you're thinking of the United States or Great Britain. They had some, they thought about it. And the San Marco Brigade was supposed to be pretty good. They're supposed to be pretty good soldiers. And they had quite a bit of shipping available in 1942 for the Operation Sea or Hercules, the invasion of Malta. But the answer to your question is yes, sort of, but it was never used. They were going to land on the Ionian Islands, for example, in the campaign against Greece, and that plan got scuttled because they needed the troops to prop up the front ashore when the Greeks counterattacked. So yeah, there were several operations planned, never carried out. There were some successes, very minor successes they had. So yeah, they thought about it, but they didn't think about it in terms of Marine divisions coming ashore or Normandy or anything. Small bean stuff.
He didn't devote very many resources to it either, really. You know, the San Marco regiment's like 3 battalions for most of the war, and they had like 3 or 4 of those. I think they were called the Cessia class, those boats with the ramp fronts. So they didn't develop it, I don't think, anywhere near as much.
Got a good picture of one.
Hey, I have one factoid I want to toss out. I just learned this week. The U.S. Navy was developing guided missiles and linked up with B.F. Skinner to train pigeons to provide a guidance system for their missiles. The pigeons were trained to peck at pictures of ships. They'd have 3 screens in front of them, and they'd start off with the thing centered, and then if they drifted off one way or the other, the pigeons would peck at the screen to get back on track or whatever here. So apparently nothing came of that. I think it was probably because the pigeons started asking for flight pay. It could have been.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting trivia fact. I saw when you sent that out, and I thought it was kind of amazing that they were using pigeons to extend submarine communications in World War I, but using pigeons as an intelligence guidance system for electronic warfare was a new one on me. That's for sure.
Speaking as a technical person, a lot of things are tried for the one or few that succeed. If you don't look, you never find.
Yes, this is true also. And B.F. Skinner, of course, is an important name in human behavior. I think we all know who he is.
Yeah, the U.S. Army found that out to their horror when they trained bats to distribute incendiaries.
And what happened?
The bat infested the entire base and burned half of it down.
Bats just can't be trained.
Did their job that they were told to do. See you next time.
Yeah, thank you, Ralph.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
One other pigeon story, or actually bird story, was that the British considered training seagulls to flock around periscopes in that was one of the suggestions the British public made in 1915 to advance the anti-submarine war. And apparently they tried it, but it didn't work. So.
Vince, I was going to make one little quibble on the very end of your talk when you talk about the British being pushed back to Alamein and Ultra sort of bailing them out at the last minute. I can't think of any instance in the ground campaign where Ultra was really able to be translated into operational effectiveness on the ground. their army just did not have their act together in terms of combined arms warfare to the point that they could translate good intelligence into a victory against Rommel. So,
Yeah, I'm not going to contest your quibble.
it's not.
I don't know enough about it.
Yeah.
I do know that at sea they were starting to get better use of Ultra by the end of 42. I think the whole story of Ultra in the Mediterranean is fascinating. If you just look at all the messages, and that's all freely available on the TNA website. You can download all the Ultra decryptions, and you can spend the rest of your life reading them if you're so inclined.
Right.
But
is enough, I think. Yeah.
Oh, just the amount of traffic they were receiving in the Mediterranean every day, and all this traffic had to come through the Cunningham or had the Air Force or the ground forces, and there's no staff assigned to really review it. Very little staff, and a lot of it is just chatter. A lot of it is just meaningless changes in plans. I mean, you have to pick out all the good stuff from all the chaff, and it's not easy to do.
Yeah.
So Ultra didn't do all that much, in all honesty, in the first 2 years of its use. It did some stuff, but didn't do as much as it's credited for.
Well, related to that is a related question then to that. Were the Italians chatty regarding communications? Because I'll give you an example. Ultra is way overrated late in the war. It almost fails at Philippine Sea. We have almost no good information on what the Japanese carrier fleet is doing going into film. It's amazing the lack of info. That battle is fought almost in pre-Ultra sense, as far as being able to look. Submarines encounter their carriers, not Ultra. So I was wondering, that was because the Japanese were not being chatty at Philippine Sea. There's almost no communications, except always long signal to Tokyo. So the Italians that way?
Radios. It's only good if you're sending traffic. And the German Luftwaffe and the German Railroad Authority were famous for their overuse of radio communications. And that's where a lot of the Ultra information came from. And they would pick up Italian convoys based upon German aircraft assignments. And so if you're talking about the great impact, the great benefit that the German Air Force provided to the Italians in their campaigns, one could argue that in fact, the German Air Force was a liability. Yeah, they dropped bombs on Malta, but most of them didn't hit anything. But they certainly provided the British with a wealth of information, and that all came from the Air Force, most of it anyway. So, these questions are a little bit more complicated, I think, than they seem in the beginning. And Ultra, with its wonderful press and all the movies and all the shorten the war by 2 years, this, that, and the other, people made a big deal about it when it was first revealed, and they thought, oh, this is it. And now we've been spending the last 20 years saying, well, maybe it wasn't it. Maybe it wasn't. And the Germans, they did this in World War I too. They overtalked, And the Italians tended to be very reticent. They were very security conscious. One of the technologies they tried to develop instead of sonar, instead of radar, were secure radio communications. And they developed what they thought was a very high-tech, advanced system of communication between ships that couldn't be intercepted or listened into. That was one of their priorities. So.
Vince, I got to go, but thanks a lot for the talk, and I agree with most of what you said.
Well,
thanks a lot, though. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Evan, thank you for coming.
I love all those furry Periscope pop-ups around you too.
Yeah. There's a cat that had something to say.
Yeah, it's tea time. Tea time. Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao. Rich, you leaving? Bye, Rich.
I'm gonna go. Sorry I was late.
You can make it.
Couldn't help it.
You can watch the entire recording later.
I will. Okay. Take care.
You. Thank you. And then there were 10.
Us, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, endlessly fascinating topic, and I think I know that a lot of the new literature on the Italian participation in World War II is subject to dispute or interpretation or whatever. But I think one of the reasons why I enjoy this topic so much is I think that there are, more than two sides to every story. And I think this story has several sides that still need to be told and appreciated and understood in the proper context. And that's my major interest. I don't know if I'm ever going to return to the Mediterranean in a book project, but God willing, and if the energy continues, it's a distinct possibility. So, any other comments or questions? Thank you very much for coming. And our next presentation will be Evan. He'll be in early January talking about the Royal Navy and the eclipse of the Royal Navy. And by Royal Navy, I mean the British Royal Navy. I don't mean the Italian Royal Navy or the Greek Royal Navy or any other Royal Navy. So that should be a very good one. And then we have Dan is going to be doing Tarawa in February, and it's going to be, was Tarawa really necessary? Is that correct? He's muted, so he can nod his head.
Yeah, that's pretty close. It's a yes and no kind of question.
Okay. And then our last scheduled presentation will be in March, and that will be held talking about how the U.S. has simulated combat lessons and developed doctrine on that basis. Interesting stuff. And we have slots open going forward from there. So if anybody who is listening is interested in doing a Q&A, Garrett, you want to talk about why didn't we do Sledgehammer in 1942 as we should have? That's a valid topic.
Oh, I would love to, of course.
Okay, well, let's think about that. Tony, if you want to say something, you thinking about saying something? Brian, if you want an opportunity, let me know. I mean, Mike, if you want to talk about one of these things, let me know. So.